Good afternoon. Welcome to our fourth Cloud City Virtual Meetup. I'm Charles Fitzgerald, along with Chris Kelly, who is once again manning the Zoom controls. We are the organizers. Chris and I are technology enthusiasts and somewhat irreverent angel investors in Seattle. We're coming to you live and direct from Cloud City. Normally, this is where I'd make a broad claim that we've decoupled from geography and all that. But today, we're going to be very geographic and focus specifically on the Seattle tech ecosystem. And as bleak as things may look now, we will eventually emerge from this pandemic. So our goal for the hour is to reflect on where we are today and what a post-pandemic Seattle tech ecosystem might look like. There is lots of discussion about the future of various tech cities. San Francisco, and to a lesser extent, the more traditional Silicon Valley, are somewhat embattled at the moment. There have been some high-profile departures, and there's some data that suggests a significant number of people have left the Bay Area, at least temporarily. And while the traditional top dog of tech, say that 3 times fast, is having a bit of an existential crisis, cities like Austin and Miami are at least doing great PR to position themselves as the new technology hubs. Seattle is conspicuously missing in this discussion, which we are here to rectify. And I'm hopeful we may even set aside Seattle's traditional Scandinavian modesty and really compare ecosystem apples to apples. That's for our panel. So the format today is a panel discussion. We have a great group. Chris DeVore is a local Seattle venture capitalist at Founders Co-op and a longtime contributor to the Seattle startup community. Dan Foster has his pulse on what's really going on with commercial real estate. And Margaret O'Mara is a historian at the University of Washington. She wrote the definitive history of Silicon Valley recently in a book called The Code. It's a good read. She's been asked a lot about Silicon Valley's future. We're going to get her take on Seattle's future. So I'm not doing justice to everybody's backgrounds. Their full bios on cloudcitymeetup.com if you're interested. But the plan is I'm going to lob questions at the panel for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. To submit a question, please use the Zoom Q&A button. So I want to start and just take a look at kind of impact to date of the pandemic on Seattle ecosystem. There's some obvious winners and losers. Good time to be in cloud or e-commerce, harder time to be in travel. I'm curious what other specific impacts people have seen. And Chris, maybe start with you. Any interesting dynamics, observations, great pivots?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of touched on it, which is anybody that was doing anything enabling face-to-face interactions, whether that's travel or retail or restaurants or you name it, just got clobbered, like kicked in, not just kicked in the shins, but like down and maybe out in some cases. And the good news or silver lining, I guess, for Seattle is we've always done boring stuff, right? Like we're kind of plumbers in the internet economy. Proud plumbers, right? And there's a lot of plumbing that people still need, in the time of a pandemic. And maybe the less obvious part of that is a lot of the traditional economy that thought they could kick the can on digitization because they could do things the old-fashioned way. They could go to trade shows or they could, fly around and meet people. They were like, oh, geez, we actually have to figure out how to do business electronically. We need that plumbing. So I would say the 80% of the economy that was sort of head in the sand, hoping they could kick the can or wait, they all realized they had to buy this stuff. And so you've seen, stocks like Zoom and other stuff just go crazy because Zoom has zoomed. And that's just one example of what people have had to do to deal with the terrible kind of constraints that this has put us all under.
Mm-hmm. Any favorite stories, particular companies, things you've seen that really are outside those broad trends?
Geez.
Say no too.
Yeah, no, I think given that there's lots of us and lots of other topics to cover, no, I think that broad theme is probably enough for now.
Okay. Anybody else have thoughts, observations, interesting anecdotes?
Well, from a commercial market perspective, I would say that we're at the tail end of a pretty unprecedented decade. And while it might seem bleak because activity is slow, it's really the means to an overdue correction in many ways, which might make it easier for tenants to achieve some of their goals.
Yeah, and we'll definitely want to talk to you about specific price direction and everything else that you got your finger on. Well, what about looking forward? I mean, are there thoughts, conclusions people have about what will change in the after? What segments look more or less interesting? Does trillion-dollar big tech continue to dominate, or what's different?
Well, I think the last year has accelerated trends, right? So that's what crises often do. They disrupt, but they also accelerate things in motion. And to Dan's point about the commercial space, I recall right before the pandemic, there was a good deal over local reporting about, local restaurateurs who were closing down because the market was oversaturated. They couldn't afford the rent. And,
Yep.
We had this, we were kind of paying, and there was a lot of pushback against all of the tech, particularly the tech growth. And we're going to talk more about that politics, I think, later. But what we've seen is big tech get bigger, and particularly, this has been a banner year for our largest tech companies, and particularly as Chris said, those that they're involved in the plumbing, as well as those that are delivering what people needed during this extraordinary time. Amazon is working both of those worlds, and certainly we continue to have an era that's being very much defined by Amazon in the way that Microsoft defined an earlier era in Seattle's sort of broader economy. So there's, we've seen definitely some disruptions, but certainly remote work and doing this via Zoom and conferences via Zoom, all that stuff. We already had people working remotely, and this was this massive experiment at scale that, yes, things are going to go back to there's going to be a new normal, but it's not going to be, now people have figured out all the things we can do virtually and how that fits into a kind of sustainable business model.
So do we think big tech continues to dominate, or are there things that may chip away at that in the after, which I put quotes around?
I think there are externalities that will, there are a lot of things in motion, that things, Washington, D.C., things that happen at the state level. And then also just markets, everyone becomes a dinosaur eventually, as uncomfortable as that seems. So there will be, if anything, the only thing I can assure you as someone who studies history, I can't predict things, but I can say for sure things are going to change, because
you get to wait before you have to write it.
I know, I do.
What about kind of indirect effects on technology? I mean, a lot of people are talking about the roaring 20s. We're going to have pent-up consumer demand. Presumably there are going to be technology companies that take more or less advantage of that. Any thoughts on other trends like that?
I mean, one thing that's impossible not to talk about is the easy money policy, the fact that the Fed is running the printing presses, and that's flooding global liquidity. And so, if money is flowing towards technology, because technology is providing growth in a low interest rate environment, you're going to see a lot of stuff get funded. So the good news is a lot of,
hasn't that been true for a couple of years?
It has, but
now
I
it's
think
going to accelerate.
I think it's going to continue. I think that the transition of leadership in Washington, particularly with Georgia, pretty much guarantees that we're gonna continue to be running a modern monetary theory experiment for a little while here, and you're gonna see a lot of stuff get funded and a lot of experiments run, which is great from an innovation standpoint. But it also means that things are like, money is going to continue to flow to technology, because technology is providing one of the bright spots of growth for investors, and there's good and bad in that, right? But that's a reality that's going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, there are people putting out 1-year economic growth numbers between 6 and 11%, which seems crazier than what we've seen over the last couple of years. Any particular impacts from that on Seattle, or is that just sort of tech across the board, the ocean of money?
So I think one of the most interesting things in Seattle, and I've been doing what I do as an investor here for the last dozen years, is it used to be really hard to get the attention of out of region investors for Seattle startups. People just didn't believe that they were good enough or aggressive enough. But between Amazon and Microsoft's ascendance, and now Geeko wrote a piece a couple weeks ago that we now have 10 unicorns, which is not a lot by San Francisco standards, but there's been an awful lot of companies that have not just done kind of local success, but have achieved the kind of success that put us on the map for investors that are looking for opportunities globally. Mm-hmm. So folks like Tiger Global and Co2 or Green Oaks or Addition, later stage firms are happily deploying capital here, and that's a really big difference, because if you hit a wall as an entrepreneur raising money, it's really hard to achieve those kind of high highs. So you need investors who are really ready to back up the truck when you want to grow. And we've seen companies have way more success here than they ever have in the past with that kind of growth curve.
Not just late stage, right? I mean, all the top tier early stage companies have investments here too. So.
Yep.
Okay. So Margaret, one of the most interesting things about your book is you made a pretty good case for the Cold War birthing the computing industry as we know it. I'm sort of fascinated what's going on with the US and China. To the degree we have a new Cold War there, do we think there are any implications, or are we just going to go back and the US and China will all happily be part of one tech ecosystem after yesterday?
I don't know about that. But yeah, there's sort of a couple of interesting things going on. I mean, one is that China is looked at what the US did in the early Cold War and took notes, and is making a lot of the state-driven investments in advanced technology and in education, human capital production that the US used to do at the federal level, and to a lesser degree with higher ed at the state level. And we don't do that as much anymore. Now, we also, I think part of the reason that the American tech flourished the way it did was this relationship between public and private that was allowed to thrive, and the privatized nature of Cold War spending, which is going to private companies and universities. It was a product of American capitalist democracy, which China is not. But the difference in the Cold War too, I mean, I'm thinking about the new Cold War versus the original one, is the original, think about Soviet computing. It was a totally separate system, right? You had siloed, on one side of the Iron Curtain, you had whole world of computing. And then in the free world, you had another. And unlike that, the two, if we're going to say this is a new Cold War, the two sides have interrelated markets, have interrelated products and technologies. I mean, Huawei is a great example, just thinking about 5G and thinking about, it's not just a matter of like rip out the hardware, don't have that router there. It's baked in, as people on this call know, it's baked in far, far deeper. So it's not as simple as this bring the jobs back home, build a wall, a sort of hypothetical wall between one and the other. It's a much more interrelated system. And I think we're going to have to be much more realistic about, look, especially in tech, it's global supply chains, global markets, whether you're making hardware or making software. And it is disentangling it in kind of the old school way and using these old school blunt instruments that is not going to be the solution. So we're gonna have to find some peaceful coexistence. But I don't know if I don't think that just with the change of administrations, it's all going to go back to the way it was in 2016.
That was sarcastic. All right. Anybody else? Any other just things you're watching as we see how things play out in Seattle over the next 5 years? Any categories you're more excited about?
Well, the one topic, and this is maybe foreshadowing of where we're going to go later, is there will be a new normal, as Margaret suggested, about where people work. But there is this question of labor mobility, and a lot of people are leaving San Francisco for quality of life reasons. And is that because of civic leadership? Is it because of taxes? Sort of unknown. And who will be the winners and losers of a new labor mobility from metro to metro? And I think there's a lot of people watching what happens. Like, will all the people who can move to the mountains because they can work from anywhere and they can ski where they want and not wait in long lift lines? Or will cities still matter? If they will matter, why will they matter? What role will they play? And how do we think about the future of cities? And so I'm interested in that topic.
Yeah, so it would be fascinating to talk about what are people seeing in terms of the impact of work from home and remote on Seattle now. I mean, do we have an exodus, or are we a beneficiary and seeing inflows of talent?
I'm interested what the commercial real estate perspective is on
that. We'll get to that in just a second. There's some data floating around. There's some LinkedIn data that says Seattle's a net beneficiary of some of the moves. I've also got a lot of anecdotal data that's pretty negative, with people, heading off to Boise or Park City or wherever it is. So, what about, do people have a sense of where companies are going to end up on this remote continuum? Everybody going to come back to work?
Yeah, one data point, and then this is just like, because we've been as we do, making new investments over the course of the pandemic. And it used to be that, when we make an investment in a team, they think about where are we going to build out our team with a real geographic lens, like where we're going to build our company in Seattle, or we're going to have some of our engineering in India. And more founders are saying we are virtual. We are a virtual company. Even if the founders are based in a place, the hiring and growth plan is explicitly geographic. And that's a new thing in my experience. And I would say it's become very much more the norm, which is companies do have a center of gravity based on where the founders are, But to explicitly design your company to not have a geography is a relatively new idea to me, at least.
But are you sold on that? I mean, clearly a lot of people are going to run that experiment. Do we think it sticks? I mean, there are some people who are very vocal. I want everybody back in the office as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just to give one example, like, at scale, like Auth0 is a portfolio company of ours here in town that was founded in Seattle by Microsoft alums. But one of the founders in particular was Argentine, and so they started early recruiting engineers in Argentina because they were really good and they were much cheaper. And they made a decision early on they chose to be virtual, and just based on observing their growth as a company or a headcount or anything else, it has not constrained their capacity to be successful. So data point one, but there's one kind of time series scaled example of it doesn't necessarily hold you back.
They've been doing it for 6, 7, 8 years. So.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, Dan, what's going on with commercial real estate in Seattle? Is this a good time to get a sublease?
Oh boy. Well, there are a few points here worth tackling. Plenty of opportunity for sublease. So, I mean, probably the most notable change in the last 8-9 months has been the amount of sublease space or disposition space that has come on. You've got close to 2.5 million square feet that have come on in Seattle alone since March, and a little more than half of that on the east side, with more expected in calendar year 2021. So when I said a much needed correction, the real handicap in real estate.
That's new space, or that's people getting rid of existing space?
That's disposition space. That's sublease space.
Okay.
So the real challenge in the commercial market over the last few years has been lack of opportunity, limited vacancy, single digit vacancy, and in many cases, low single digit vacancy. So with this new sublease space hitting the market, you're starting for the first time in a long time to see double-digit vacancies in certain submarkets, most notably downtown Seattle, to a lesser extent, Pioneer Square. I think the most interesting story in commercial real estate in calendar year 21 is going to be the dynamic between Seattle and the east side for a host of different reasons.
Yeah. The mayors of San Francisco, Austin, Miami recently had a clubhouse discussion. The discussion I want to see is between the mayors of Bellevue and Seattle. So,
exactly.
I mean, do we think Amazon's coming back to Salt Lake City? Is Bellevue HQ2 or HQ1?
Well, for the time being, it's the only HQ locally that's doing anything that's material. So,
doing anything meaning growing their space.
Correct. So, I mean, it's been publicly announced that they're targeting 25,000 employees over on that side of the water. They're certainly acting like that's exactly what they're going to do. And they've been very quiet in Seattle, letting some spaces lapse while keeping some others. So, setting Amazon aside for a second, the effect tech has had on the local market has been significant over the last number of years, in large part because it was viewed as a value to markets like San Francisco and New York. And obviously that's buoyed a lot of other companies that either want to surround talent or play to it. So I think what we're likely to see, with exception of possibly Amazon and Bellevue for a short period of time, is really some leveling off on that interest. Some of those companies are going to look to diversify their employment risk into some other markets. There is not a lot under construction that's not pre-leased. The vast majority of stuff that's already underway already have commitments lined up to it. One of the questions earlier was some of the Bay Area companies that have come in recently or have come for talent. A number of those companies have renounced those spaces and said, hey, we're looking to give that space back and rethink this thing. From a use standpoint, most of the groups we've talked to and the vendors we've talked to, the general feedback is that the core employees want to get back to work in some capacity. They want a hybrid model that allows them some level of flexibility, but they want to get back face-to-face for those 10x idea moments. There have been limited numbers of companies or folks that say, I want to work from home full time, and limited number of folks that say, I want to be back in the office full time like it was.
Do you have a sense, is there a price differential between the east side and Seattle real estate?
There's a price difference in the sense that there's a kind of a dynamic difference. So primarily because Amazon, to a lesser extent, Facebook's and some others, you've seen a leveling off of rent growth on the east side, places like Bellevue, downtown Bellevue specifically, where that's been escalating now for a decade or close to it. Seattle is where you're starting to see real corrections. So in Seattle, in many cases, you're seeing 20% corrections already. And as you start to see more disposition space hit the market, that's what's going to drive more competition for direct lease space as well. For young companies, though, it's going to be, what are their back to work philosophies and what spaces are going to accommodate those environmental goals. As we all know, not every space out there is of equal quality. Yeah, and so there's going to be a continued conversation around what kind of lifestyle, quality of life you want, how's the air quality, physically, where does it sit given the current dynamics if you were to go downtown Bellevue or downtown Seattle right now.
Mm-hmm.
So any thoughts on specific neighborhoods? I mean, Pioneer Square, downtown, South Lake Union?
South Lake Union is still kind of a tough nut to crack because of Amazon, Google, Facebook. Really the most dynamic sector you're likely to see in calendar year 21 is life science. And on the Seattle side, that's where it's going to concentrate. I think you're already seeing the greatest movement in downtown Seattle and Pioneer Square. Downtown Seattle specifically, I think, is going to be really challenged for the foreseeable future.
What about the residential side of things? I saw some numbers on Seattle rents, and the neighborhood with the biggest decline was South Lake Union.
Well, I don't want to pretend to be a residential expert,
yeah.
but I think that's primarily because, you've got a lot of, apartments, condominiums, and in-city lifestyle that people move away from. I think in general, much like during the last recession we experienced, Seattle's well positioned, not just because we've got, a good base with Amazon, Microsoft, and some others, but for what people now want to do, the quality of life component, we still have a great offering for that. We're still a 40% discount to the Bay Area. The head tax that's been imposed in Seattle has caught those, the attention of a lot of folks. So I think that's gonna steer some people away for the foreseeable future.
Well, don't we think Amazon's already, Amazon's executive staff, don't we think they work out of Bellevue already? A lot of them live over there.
Yeah. And I obviously that had a lot to do with what they're now doing over in Bellevue. There's been some speculation as to will others flow that direction, and that speculation continues. It hasn't necessarily materialized just yet outside of Amazon, but it is being discussed.
So if you were to net out advice to startups, what should they be thinking about for real estate in Seattle or the East Side?
Well, I think the good news is that we have more inventory to choose from and more flexibility. So when you're young and you're trying to accomplish 10 different things at the same time, that disposition opportunity is going to help out. And when I say disposition opportunity, it's not just signing up for shorter commitments, but in some cases, you're seeing companies willing to take 30 to 50% recoveries on those opportunities, which is good and welcomed in a market that's been really tight for a while.
Right.
And
So we're going to have price declines are going to clear the market, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, you're going to see better value in Seattle for a while than you're going to see in the East Side. But depending on where you want to focus your talent, there's going to be opportunities on both sides of the water.
Any sense of price differentials between San Francisco and Seattle?
Well, I don't spend a ton of time down in San Francisco, so what I understand is obviously they're correcting through disposition pretty dramatically.
More dramatically than Seattle?
Yes, that's my understanding.
All right, interesting.
But their rates, started at a much higher level.
Yeah, their highs have always been higher, and the lows are always lower. We're we modulate more here. We're kind of in I think it's
Little
interesting just to add to thinking about the, what Dan was saying about Bellevue versus Seattle. This is kind of this ongoing tension of tech being kind of having been urbanized in sort of over the last 20 years. Like think about, the old model was a suburban campus like Microsoft had. And it's in Seattle and in other places, it's come to the city in part because that's where the workforce wants to be. And it's created, and look, just like you don't want friction in the products that you create, companies don't want friction in the real estate. That's one reason that they've gravitated towards places where there's less friction, where it's more welcoming. And Bellevue is a lower friction environment, even though it's become a more urbanized suburb. And I think that's also kind of where I think I know we're going to head in this way, but kind of where the appeal of places like Austin and Miami also less friction.
Well, let's talk about some of the other kinds of friction. I mean, if you look at the exodus from San Francisco, a lot of it, or at least one of the causes, seems to be declining quality of life, increasing crime, drugs, homelessness, city government that is seen as somewhere between incompetent, adversarial, not interested in the set of problems. Do we think Seattle's on the same path when it comes to local governance and quality of life, particularly downtown?
Well, it's some of this, yes, some of the same dynamics, and it's some of the same. I mean, I think the dilemma that really all cities have, and this is I think a dilemma of tech. Tech has flourished in chasing relatively, lower tax, low friction environments, but that also means that there are fewer revenues to sort of provide for services that keep cities going. And so when you have a workforce that wants to be in dynamic, dense urban areas, and you have major employers that are resistant to, that come into the game at a pretty good arrangement, and as we saw in the infamous head tax debacle, don't want to change that. I mean, part of this is tech has grown so much and become kind of the center of the action. Certainly in Stanford, you see this most dramatically in San Francisco. For a long time, tech was truly down south. It was in the South Bay, and people would live in San Francisco, but there wasn't that. Salesforce was there, but not that much else. And so now we have, it's, I don't know if the answer is really that, these very wealthy companies, and it should just find the lowest tax base they can find. I know that's kind of fashionable and alluring, but that doesn't really solve the problem, because you don't get, what taxes pay for is a more sustainable, a more equitable.
There's definitely a revenue issue. And I went and I looked at Seattle budget. So Seattle budget has grown at twice the rate of population growth in the city over the last 10 years. So there is money there. It's not, I mean, it's interesting. Some of the budgets that are very, very flat. You look at the police budget has essentially been flat for 10 years, and some of the other things have grown pretty dramatically. So there definitely are tax issues, but there's also a sort of how do we assess competence and the outputs that we're getting from those expenditures. And Seattle, we've seen very high leadership churn, right? Mayor's out, the police chief's out, the school superintendent's out. I think the Seattle Times was asking, has the city become ungovernable? So there are certainly money issues, but there are other issues in terms of, how effective they are at spending that money and achieving the results.
And I also think it's who's the most engaged, who are the citizens that are most engaged or sort of have the time. And when you're building a startup, for example, or even when you're running a major multinational tech company, you're kind of heads down focused on your work. You've got you've got a day job, and it's a big one. And what sort of the voices that have shaped Seattle politics and San Francisco politics have not necessarily been the ones that share, it's a different set of voices. And so
that's a very charitable way to put it. So.
And I think the other thing too is it's not just taxation, it's also regulation, and particularly the regulation of land use and real estate. So both San Francisco and Seattle are overwhelmingly single family. I mean, Seattle particularly, kind of 80%, upward of 80% single family home density zoning. And that is a huge point of tension and friction between, homeowners and sort of the broader thinking about the greater good. And, frankly, when you have this huge influx of people and jobs, it's created this pressure on the housing market, and so it all spills over. So these things, it's kind of created this perfect storm that is not, and I think, and I've sort of on the record for saying that, tech is, I think, unfairly blamed for the problems that come from this growth. It's not, I'm not saying that the sector should not play a role, and we've seen Microsoft and now Amazon putting big investments into housing in Western Washington, for example. But these are pre-existing conditions that have to do with the political economy of these places that tech isn't solely responsible for. And I think people need to recognize that.
So are we optimistic or pessimistic that we'll see better local governance to address some of these issues?
I'd say the jury's out at this point. I mean, I think the shift to neighborhood-based districting has not been a net positive for Seattle, because you tend to have much more kind of parochial, narrow issue driven campaigning, as opposed to city. It's like what's good for the city is no longer the conversation. It's what does my neighborhood want? So that was a net negative change, I think. And I think, Margaret's point is also like the basics. The reason people come here isn't for its politics necessarily. They come for affordable housing and good transportation and good schools and a high quality of life. And it's those sort of basic things that need to be delivered before we have the luxury of arguing about, our political virtue. And I think, unfortunately, we seem to have gotten the order of those reversed lately, because it's so easy to demonize and point fingers and say, well, it's those awful tech people that are screwing up the city. And there are real problems, there are real issues, and the industry broadly needs to contribute to the economics of the city to make the thing work. But it does feel like the cart has been put before the horse in terms of, let's get the basics right first before we argue about dividing the pie. And so I worry that absent really good leadership that has great communication skills and great coalition building skills, we're going to continue to have this very fractured kind of neighborhood finger pointy kind of politics that are prevailed nationally, but have trickled down to our local politics as well.
So optimistic or pessimistic about the political direction?
I guess I would, I know that Jenny Durkin has said she's not gonna run again. I don't know enough about who is in the running, but like a lot of organizations, a lot of it comes down to leadership, and really good, effective leadership with good coalition and building and communication skills can make a big difference. So I would say jury's out until we see who the leaders are, who are going to shape the next 5 or 10 years of the city.
Favorite candidate for mayor?
I do not.
Okay. Anybody else have someone they'd like to nominate?
Chris DeVore.
All right.
Margaret O'Mara.
We'll take
if
over.
Nominated, I will not run.
Well, we have a mayor and we also have a city council, which I think is also, this is something that again long predates our era. That's really kind of this divided government that creates a lot of friction at the municipal level. And if you do not have synergy and harmony there, then that really, as we've seen pretty dramatically in the last 5 years, gums things up.
Ever so slightly. All right.
So
well,
slightly.
It doesn't sound like we're going to solve the political issues anytime soon. Let's sort of, as the last topic, let's zoom out a little bit. I'd love to get each of your takes on kind of the Seattle trajectory over the next 5 years. How the pandemic changes that trajectory. How do we stack up with other ecosystems? Can we possibly keep up with Miami and Austin? And that was more sarcasm right there. But I just love to hear the kind of the big picture take on how do you think the Seattle ecosystem is going to evolve over the coming years?
I mean, I'll kick off just because it's, when you look at some of the biggest drivers of growth in the job market and economic, like stock market kind of outcomes, the fact that we have 2 of the 5 most valuable tech companies based here is a really powerful driver. And particularly as regulatory becomes the biggest existential threat to that group, the fact that Microsoft sort of weathered its existential regulatory battle 20 years ago, and that Amazon's business model, because it's much more customer centric and transactional, that they make money by solving problems for people, whereas Google and Facebook make money by selling their users to other people in the form of advertising. I would say that we are hedged a little bit against the biggest threat to the tech economy being an engine of growth, and San Francisco is more exposed. Apple maybe is jury's out on Apple, but I think Google and Facebook are really in for a tough run as the government tries to reimagine what antitrust looks like in a tech world.
Someday we're going to do a 3-hour panel on antitrust, but not today.
Yeah.
All right, Margaret, Dan, thoughts?
Go ahead, Margaret.
I agree that the two biggest assets are Amazon and Microsoft, and agree with Chris that they are sort of relatively more insulated in this anti-tech moment. They are Microsoft position particularly is very well positioned. It's the adult in the room,
keeping their heads down.
I tell you, yeah. I mean, who would have thunk it back in back in the day when but it really is they've positioned themselves very well, and they're surging for all sorts of reasons. And I think that we're going to continue to benefit from when San Francisco struggles, we benefit. Like we were already getting people migrating from the Bay Area here, in part because the tech ecosystem now is so robust and so diverse, right? So you can go to a whole host of the ecosystem just consists of more companies, large, medium, and small, including a startup community of the size that wasn't here when I moved here in 2004. It really, from the Bay Area, I was like, oh, this is Microsoft's town, and we're just living in it. Like it felt, Amazon was here, but it was kind of at a different stage in its growth, and it's very, very different now, and much more well established. And there's there's a lot more going on. But there's there's a kind of quality of life value prop. It's the one. Seattle still looks cheap to people coming from the Bay Area. Maybe the only place that it looks cheap to. But that's an advantage if that's the and thinking about the kind of the migration to the exodus to Bend, like or to Boise or to other places. Like it isn't quite clear yet. The numbers aren't making it clear. Like how much of that is going to be temporary, kind of just pandemic duration, and how much will come back. There may be people who are living in Tahoe full time now, and they're like, no, I'm going to go back somewhere else for when things get back for real. So we don't quite know yet, but it seems like Seattle is well positioned because it kind of offers a combination of lots of, the quality of life that has drawn a lot of people here historically, I think will also be a regional advantage going forward.
Anything we should do to take advantage of San Francisco in their moment of need? No comment.
No comment.
All right, comment. You can do that.
So I will say, I'll jump on that, which is, we were talking about the capital markets earlier. The truth of the matter is San Francisco is still the Wall Street for innovation finance. And so having an adversarial relationship with that market is just not productive, because if you're an entrepreneur here, you want that market to care about you and to invest in you, and you want to be able to recruit leaders from that market. So there's always it's like a big brother, little brother. We're always going to snipe at each other, but there's an awful lot of symbiosis and family resemblance. And I think that's to the good for both of us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Our regional advantage for a long time has been the ease with which you can fly down and raise money in a day and come back. Right. So that is, and the concept. So you may have an exodus of tech firms from the Bay Area for real estate considerations, labor market, all sorts of things. But the money remains overwhelmingly concentrated there, which is actually part of the problem. That's why San Francisco has such stress on its housing market. You have, VCs with $12 million houses.
They can't build new houses either.
They can't build new houses. And so I think that's another thing. We still have, there's a lot we can do to make zoning better and densify certain parts of the city that really could handle it. But we are ahead of the Bay Area, and certainly Seattle's ahead of San Francisco on that metric. It's a low bar, but enlarging the supply of housing, period, it cascades down to all sorts of other, just makes it more affordable, accessible, escalator of upward mobility for more people, and that's good for the region.
Yep. So Dan, any thoughts on absorbing the, I think you said 2.5 million square feet of space
Yeah.
that's available?
My perspective is, since I'll just focus on the commercial aspect of things in real estate, our fundamentals here have been proven already. We stood the storm better than most during the last recession. I expect the same here. But when it comes to the commercial office market, this should serve us well. There's an argument that many would make that the office market has been relatively unhealthy the last few years. To have an office market balance, you would typically want to see 10 to 12% of vacancy. What that provides is building owners an opportunity to be viable, have value. It provides the users out there an opportunity to drive leverage and actually achieve lease terms that are viable for their company and their goals. Recently we've seen in certain submarkets vacancy rates below 5%. So what I think will come of this over the next couple of years is an overdue correction that will serve the tenant base in our area quite well. Better opportunity, especially for young firms that either have been further scrutinized because of credit, youth, or or forced into longer commitments than they want to make. Those are some of the corrections that we're going to be seeing over the next 12 to 24 months, and they'll be well received.
Okay. So an underlying theme in this discussion is it's kind of more of the same. I mean, we haven't talked about radical new markets, new segments. Some of the key drivers of the technology industry are getting pretty long in the tooth, right? I mean, whether it's the computing revolution, mobile, the internet, those things are all pretty mature. Are there any, dare I say, black swan opportunities, new industries that maybe people are not paying attention to in the Seattle area that could be an important part of the city's next wave?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say two things that are on sort of different forks of that question. One is, when we were talking about COVID, the reality is, even though all of us on the West Coast have been adopting modern software with enthusiasm for 20 years, a lot of the economy nationally and globally is still dragging their feet. So there's just an awful lot of life still left in cloud infrastructure and business process automation. Like, it's boring, but holy cow, like, there's just an awful lot of it still to go. So like, let's not underestimate how much headroom there still is on that stuff. But to your question about looking forward, I think sort of one particular area that a lot of people are hopeful about, I don't know enough about it to be authoritative, but it's certainly, we've seen more financings that suggest it's a thing, is as healthcare becomes more and more software powered, data driven, whether it's how do you model proteins to develop new pharmaceuticals, or how do you run the business of healthcare. Seattle's strength, or the University of Washington's real strength in healthcare and life sciences, has made a lot of people hopeful that the integration of IT and healthcare is the next big explosive opportunity for us. And certainly it's eye-popping to see the financings and even IPOs of these very young pre-revenue companies here. Sana Biosciences is the most recent one, where clearly investors globally are seeing a lot of value in the innovations coming out of that community here. So I don't know if you're or others are more knowledgeable about that, but that feels like if you're looking for the next big thing, that's one to look at. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think we're coming into, look at, with a new administration, there's a real, it's going to be, they're not going to let a crisis go to waste. In a previous era, Seattle benefited from flows of federal financing for science, for higher education, for biomedicine, for all sorts of things. And that accompanied with a kind of a pivot on immigration policy, which both in sort of real terms, in terms of making it easier for people to come here to live and to study, but also kind of warming up the chill that has descended over the rest of the world in terms of wanting to come here or feeling like that's in their future. I think that both of those could work to Seattle's. Canada, huh? Yeah. It will work to Seattle's benefit. I mean, thinking about like where there are going to be public investments, say, in alternative fuels and biomedicine, that will kind of put the thumb on the scale, create incentives for new markets to really grow and thrive, and make it worth more private sector actors' while to get in that space or invest in that space. And it seems like we are well positioned across in both of those realms, green tech and in healthcare generally to take advantage of that.
I fully believe it'll be something different. I just don't know what the different thing will be. So we'll see what that is. So we have some questions. There are a couple of questions around work from home. How sustainable is it? What is the model that's actually going to work? I actually did a quick poll prior to this of some startups I work with, and the sample is less than 20. But the numbers I got, 15% of companies said all their employees would return to the office. 77% said their office space needs will decline. And only 30% said all their hiring were local people who could come to the office if and when they had an office again. Any thoughts on, where we're going to end up on that continuum? How many days a week do we expect people to go into the office? Is it going to be flexible, or different companies going to do different things? Any bets anybody wants to make?
I'll address that first. From what we're seeing, the vast majority of companies are going to make it back into the office. The real question is, what will that office environment look like and how will it operate? The vast majority of those companies, unless some changes, are going to implement a hybrid work from office, work from home model, so that they can appease not only what they've learned from the staff, but also what this opportunity has provided them in studies. So it's been proven that you can be productive in that hybrid environment. You can be productive from home. What they're really after is maintaining some sort of a work environment in office that allows major employers to continue to recruit and retain, and then having an environment that fosters big idea. Mm-hmm. So, what we've seen the last 9 months is a dramatic decrease, if not complete halt, in overall leasing activity. That's starting to tick up now, but you're seeing those requirements shrink. And I think that will be the trend. You're going to see a general downsizing in overall requirement activity pick up in 21, and the companies that can really reinventing the way that they actually use their space and the way it's built.
And the other thing I'd add from a human standpoint to that is, particularly in young high growth organizations where people's work is it's knowledge work and it's highly creative. People often like their colleagues. They enjoy spending time with them. They like to get together not only to be productive, but it's part of their social life, and it's part of how they sort of feed their brains and energy. So I think it's very unlikely that everybody who works in tech is going to be like, oh, I'm going to go somewhere where I can be by myself and ski all day every day, because people actually like their work and their colleagues and want to see them in person. I think that's not going to go.
Yeah, I'd add, I think there's a mentorship element too, where I spent a lot of time at Microsoft on, early in my career on the outer circle of the big meeting room, and you learn a lot. You're not going to be on that Zoom call, but watching that process and kind of internalizing how decisions get made and what's important and what's the strategy, people are missing out on that today. So the human capital is not getting developed for the long term.
Yeah, and I think that's a very powerful force. And at IBM, it was went all remote, like back in the day, sort of the 90s, tried to sort of send all of the sort of whole swath of its workforce remote, and had many challenges that prompted it to go back to in-person work. This is all well before pre-pandemic. But one of the things was, IBM famously had a very important mentorship culture that brought people up the ranks and kind of had older people mentoring younger ones, and that was incredibly difficult to do when people were all telecommuting and remote. And so that is, I think what we're learning through this grand experiment is both that multiple models of the workplace can exist. It kind of depends on what you're doing, where you're working, how big your company is, what the financial imperatives are, and that hybrid has a lot of appeal to a lot of people, including, I think there are many people who become parents who are working at big companies like Amazon and Microsoft, and they would like to I'd like to work in the office 3 days a week and at home 2 days a week. And in the before times, that often was, they ended up leaving, or they ended up not being able to do that because FaceTime was so important. So now we've kind of created a range of new norms that I would hope, if you want to be optimistic about it, it creates space not only to recruit people regardless of geography, just their tolerance for, time zone shifts is the only barrier, but also people at various stages in their careers and their life course. So they can kind of, it would be really exciting if this kind of opens this up. So you basically get a bigger talent pool. So people can be part of this tech workforce in a whole range of circumstances and change that over time.
Another question, what short and long-term investments have you identified in the technology space that support social and economic growth in our city? So Margaret, you mentioned the real estate investments that Microsoft and Amazon have announced. Are there other things that we'd like to see the technology companies do to contribute back to the city itself?
I think that's a big part, but I think we also need to recognize that, however the billions that come from these companies is still not, you need to have public investment too. And you need to figure out fix the public revenue, make that make sense and make that fair and equitable, because even, just looking at the numbers, it's just never as much. and we also shouldn't expect the private sector to fill our potholes. Like there are other things, it's a combination of both.
Right.
I think related, one of the things I'm interested to see, because we obviously as taxpayers funded a big expansion of the light rail system, and a lot of that's going to light up this year, or at least my understanding is with Sound Transit, a lot of the current expansion of the light rail is going to like the U District, for example, that station's supposed to light up this year, and there's like 7 cranes right now in the U District. So the fabric of the city, I think, is going to change in interesting ways. Where people live, where they work, how they get around. Granted, no one's riding, not no one, very few people.
We do think the U District is the next South Lake Union, right? Or Pioneer
Well,
Square.
but the same thing could be said. So Facebook actually wound up taking over the lease of, so REI had built out a big new headquarters building in the Spring District on the east side, which is a light rail terminus. REI abandoned that space in the middle of COVID, and Facebook took it over. So it's really, and this is this is obvious to anyone who sort of follows urban real estate. Often the stations around effective public transit become urban mini cores in themselves. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that existing investment in infrastructure is going to change the fabric of the city and the flow of people around work and home.
Yeah, and as Chris and I know intimately, the U District's real estate, and Dan, I'm sure it's like a very different mix than Bellevue. You don't have, the real challenge I think for the U District is you don't have those large parcels. And so for particularly big companies that could be anchors that want a big footprint and need it, that's been a sticking point. So one hopes that the light rail station opening will generate more commercial activity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Historically, the assemblage has been the barrier to entry for the districts, from doing partnerships between private and public partnerships with the university. How do you build there? That's changed. So you've got a handful of commercial development opportunities that are in play there now. And now it's just a matter of making it attractive to those private employers, most notably the tech employers that can really drive a market like that. And to your point, to the earlier point that was made, people have been speculated for the last 10 years, what is the next South Lake Union? So, give it another 10 or 20 years, and right now it's most likely that area.
That seems to be the consensus. All right, well, we're just about out of time. We want to give people a couple minutes before they go get on their next call. So I want to thank Chris, Dan, and Margaret, and everybody who joined us today. Couple closing items. Please go to feedback.cloudcitymeetup.com right now and let us know what you thought and who else we should talk to in future events. There will be a recording up in the next couple days on cloudcitymeetup.com. And in an uncharacteristic move, we've actually scheduled the next event. So we're scheduled for February 23rd with Joe Lonsdale. He's a prominent founder and venture capitalist who recently and quite prominently decamped from Silicon Valley to Austin. So we'll talk to him about where he's investing, but also why he left Silicon Valley. He has some thoughts on how it might be saved and what Seattle can learn from that. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Fun to be
Great
here.
to be here.